Bem-vindos a mais um debate promovido pelo Observatório de Regionalismo. O Observatório de Regionalismo é uma iniciativa inserida dentro da rede de estudos sobre política externa e regionalismo, a REPRE. Essa iniciativa, esse núcleo chamado Observatório de Regionalismo, tem por objetivo trazer discussões sobre o regionalismo, o que está acontecendo não só na nossa região, na América do Sul, mas no mundo em geral. E nesse sentido, hoje nós estamos promovendo uma discussão, né, com a presença do professor Frank Mattheis, sobre a questão do financiamento da integração, que é um tema pouco discutido na nossa área, né? Ou seja, os debates sobre regionalismo nem sempre exploram essa questão. O professor Frank, ele é professor em Bruxelas, ele vai falar em inglês hoje, por isso, a partir de agora, a nossa conversa vai ser toda em inglês, né, para poder propiciar um diálogo melhor aqui com o nosso convidado. Então, a palestra hoje, o título é The Finances of Regional Organizations in Comparative Perspective, and Professor Mattheis is a researcher at the Institute for European Studies at the Université Libre de Bruxelles, as well as Associate Research Fellow at the United Nations University Institute on Comparative Regional Integration Studies. He's publishing this book. It's a very good book. The book published is The Finance of Regional Organizations, the Global South, Follow the Money. It's organized with Professor Engel, to have contributed writing a chapter on Mercosur, and thus we have the pleasure to have Professor Frank here with us to talk about the findings of the book and the main issues of this agenda. So, Professor Frank, thank you very much, and it's all for you now.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Karina, for giving me this opportunity and for inviting me to present some findings of the book and also of where new avenues for research might lie ahead for this research field. So as Professor Karina mentioned, so this is a book that the presentation is going to be largely based on. So maybe just a little bit of background to this book. So this idea, it was about 3 years ago with my co-editor Ulf Engel. He published a working paper on the finances of the African Union, and this started us talking about, well, it would be interesting to look more into this topic, to do more comparative work. Then we organized a small workshop in South Africa back then, because we were at first only interested in African regional organizations, and the more we started working on it, the more we thought, well, it would be also more interesting to go further geographically, to include other parts of the regions, and this is where Professor Karina and also Dr. Clarissa together, they were so kind to provide insights on Mercosur. Okay, I'll start my presentation. Here we go. All right. So the topic, as you've seen and heard, the finances of regional organizations in comparative perspective. So what brought us first to the topic of regional organizations? First of all, is as Karina said, there's quite a literature gap in this regards, which we found quite surprising, because there's so much done on European Union budgets, also on United Nations budgets, and there were there were very early efforts back in the early 70s by Joseph Nye, who proposed the idea of what he called service integration. So service integration is a bit of a misleading term, but what he actually meant is how much money member states contribute to their organizations, to use this as an indicator, as a measurement for regional integration. So he proposed that, but then well, he moved on to doing other things, became famous for other work he's been doing, and nobody really picked up that idea. And so only more recently, over the last 10 years, colleagues such as Philippe de Lombarde or Julia Gray have picked up the idea of, well, let's dig in a bit more into regional budgets and do some quantitative and qualitative work. There has been generally a neglect of budgets in the literature, surprisingly, even when works attest an institutional failure to an organizations. So there's no shortage of literature that is saying, well, this regional organization doesn't work properly, or it's failing to deliver its ambitions and objectives. But there's very little connection brought back to, well, how much of this failure is maybe a financial issue. There is a large empirical bias in the literature. So as I've said, there's a lot of work on European Union budgets, which has resulted in a certain Eurocentrism. If regional organizations do not have this 1% budget that the EU has, if they have much less, then they would be considered a failure. So this type of Eurocentrism, but also a conceptual bias. So the idea that there would be a sort of what has been called a bureaucratic universalism, so that all regional organizations would converge to one model of financing. And we wanted to dig up into that, and we actually found that, well, there's maybe not a convergence to one model, but there's rather a clustering around different models. What has also been neglected as a consequence has been the key features of regionalism in the Global South. So regional organizations usually where state sovereignty plays an important role. Countries have very specific socioeconomic challenges that you might not have in Europe, and they are very, very member-driven. So there's, in most cases, a very weak secretariat. So if you take the Mercosur secretariat, for instance, it's not a proper actor in itself as the European Union Commission. And lastly, there's also a connection to be made with a policy debate, which is very vivid in Europe at the moment. For those of you that are following it, there's this big negotiations about how should the next budget of the EU look like, how much money should the member states put in, will the EU have its own resources, or will it still be dependent on member states? But there's a similar debate going on in Africa, more on the idea that the African Union needs to become more autonomous in its financing, and needs to stop relying on development aid. So there's a policy debate to connect to and to feed into. So to kind of address both this Eurocentrism and bureaucratic universalism, so what we proposed in this book was to start from the Global South. So using here Torres Garcia's idea of just like let's flip around the map of the world, and let's start from the south as if it was our north, and not to say that there's a specific budget that is exclusive to the south, but to start empirically from the south, and in order to generalize some findings, and then we can have a more meaningful dialogue with EU budget studies or UN budget studies. So the first challenge was to narrow down the cases. So there are more or less 60 to 70 regional multi-purpose organizations across the world. Some say a little bit more, some say less, but more or less in that area. So we started of those. We went down to having a focus on the Global South particularly. We, of course, had to look for regional organizations that have at least a minimal formal financial structure. There are some regional organizations that do not even have that, so they don't really fit that bill. Then they needed to have some regional expenses. So at first we were looking for peace and security, because that's usually very expensive expenditure, and then we expanded to other options like economic now, of course, health expenses become an issue for regional organizations. And then lastly, we wanted to cover more or less all corners of the globe and also represent those organizations that are often neglected or not studied properly. So this is a selection. I think there wasn't space for all of the organizations that we covered in the book, but those are the majority of them. So we've really tried to cover all areas of the global south, including some organizations for which an analysis of a budget has not been done at all before. There's some organizations where you have in-depth books covering a specific regional organizations where they also talk about budgets, but there are some here that where budgets have not played a role at all before. So I'll in this presentation, I won't go into detail into the single organizations, but what I'll do is I'll give an overview of the findings and trends that we've seen. So I'm kind of compiling the analysis from the book in comparative perspective. So how do we make sense of the budget? So the first idea, a kind of prototypology that we came up is, well, let's look at the budget size. So the first number that you come across, so how much money does an organization have? So it's a very basic figure. So this is already useful as a tool where you can distinguish active from inactive regional organizations. So those that are still having a meaningful purpose and those that only exist by name only. So it serves as on a basic level for that. It's also an indicator for capacity. So one can assume that, well, the more budget you have, the more able you're doing to implement policies, etc. However, we also found that budget size alone has a very limited explanatory value. So it doesn't, knowing that one organization has more money than another doesn't really explain anything about why that is and the political economy behind it. An alternative is to look more at relative figures, so how much in percentage of public expenditure is being done regional compared to national. So this would be an alternative to already give it more of a meaning. And so we organized the cases according to the budget figures. So this is what we've done here. So their budget in million US dollars, and on the very left side you'll see the ratio between members and donors. So we'll come back to that in a minute. This is very important because this marks a difference to how much of that money comes from the outside and how much comes mainly from the inside. So what we see in budget figures, there's huge differences between organizations such as the African Union or ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which have a sizable budget, and then you have organizations lower down the table, collective security treaty organizations, although it's a community of Portuguese language countries, which have a tiny budget, so $2-3 million. So this is really nothing in terms of any public administration. Any small city has a larger budget than this. So this already gives you an idea of where does the regional organization that I'm interested in, where does it stand? So Mercosur and UNU are, for instance, are rather on the lower rank with a fairly small budget. However, we'll see in a minute also that these official figures can be sometimes masking the reality behind them. So there might be actually much more money flowing, but it doesn't go through the central secretariat, so it doesn't count as a regional budget. But it's for many of these cases, like the CSTO in Central Asia, we see there's much more money flowing, but it's circumventing the regional budget. So this is not necessarily a good indicator for how much activity is going on. On the ratio between members and donors, so there also we see huge differences. So there are some organizations in the Global South where development aid doesn't play any role at all. And there are others where you have up to 90% of the money that comes from the outside, so which are very dependent on aid budgets. The second typology out of three is the funding sources. So how can we differentiate organizations according to where the money is coming from? So the first idea was, well, looking at these donor-dependent countries that, or regional organizations rather that are indicated. So those regional organizations where half or more of the budget comes from the outside, and so development aid plays a large role. Second category would be those that are very dependent on the member states. So they largely depend on sometimes just one, sometimes a group of member states that provide these resources. So it's a very constrained club also. Then lastly, there are those that are semi-autonomous, we would call them. So that's still a very rare breed of having properly semi-autonomous regional organization. There's no fully autonomous organizations yet, but there are some that have elements of autonomy. So this means that they can either raise part of their money themselves, so they can there's some levy, there's some tax that they can have, or they have strong mechanisms to raise taxes or income from a national basis, so which we could consider semi-autonomous, where they can rely on a fairly stable budget coming in. And lastly, a differentiation that we found was useful to make is to differentiate between core budgets and integration activities. So what that means is core budget is the building, the salaries, the really what you just need to keep a secretariat running, versus integration activities. Activities, this would be, say, a military intervention or constructing some infrastructure on a regional level. So what we see is that there are organizations that might be very member state dependent for the core budget, but they're donor dependent for their activities. So whereas the members say, well, we'll pay for the core activities, we don't want donors to intervene in these strategic parts, but when it comes to integration activities, the regional organizations has to look for funding on its own. So we came up with this typology based on the sources of funding, with a few examples that I put here. So there are organizations that are donor dependent even on the institutional core budgets. So you have IGAD, for instance, in East Africa, and the East International Commission of the Great Lakes Regions, ECGLR, also in Africa. So those are organizations which cannot even cover their basic expenses without donors. In IGAD, we've had the example, which is to the point that not only do donors contribute the largest part of the institutional core budget, but they also help member states to pay their own fees. So basically, almost all the money is coming from the outside. So these are highly donor-dependent ones. And whereas you might have a different category where organizations are just only dependent for the integration activities. So ASEAN, for instance, we saw it's a huge amount of money coming from the outside, but it's primarily going to activities and not to the institutional core budget. So because of national sovereignty issues that ASEAN countries want them out. Member state dependent is also a large category. This is quite frequent for the institutional core budget, but partly also for integration activities. We have a few examples here. And finally, with the EAC, for instance, the East African Community, we can consider them as being on the way, at least, to semi-autonomy with the institutional core budget, that they can rely on stable budgets because they have certain cloud over the member states. But for integration activities, we didn't find any regional organizations, at least in the global south, that is semi-autonomous and so not dependent on either one member or a small group of members or on development aid. Lastly, third typology is the funding contribution formula. So this is the idea, well, how is it calculated? How much money does each member state pay into it? And there are quite a surprising diversity in terms of how do we calculate that. So there's those that, in the spirit of pure national sovereignty, the idea, well, we are independent countries. We fought for our independence against colonialism. So the spirit is we'll all have an equal share because we are equal member states. So even if you are a much richer country, say we have the example of East African community. So even Kenya, which has a much bigger economy than Burundi, pays the same equal share into the regional budget. Then, secondly, there's the idea of economic capacity. So this would be each member pays what it can afford. So a certain share of its GDP or of its national budget. Third category are paymaster or paymasters. So where you have one hegemon or a small group of hegemonic countries that say, well, we're going to pay much more than our economic capacity. So Russia is a good example for the organizations where it is a member in the post-Soviet area. Brazil, for a few years at least, was a paymaster for South American regional organizations. So where one country has a political ambition to be a regional leader and says, well, we're going to invest more than we actually should, based on a pure equal share or economic capacity calculation. There are some overlaps between those three. So the African Union, for instance, has a mixture of those. So there are 5 countries that pay the lion's share. So the big 5 countries, and then you have a larger group of, so the other 50 countries pay more according to their economic capacity. So the calculation can be also a mix of those. The problem with this typology is that it excludes donors, and we've seen that donors can be very important. So this is only about how is it being calculated, what member states contribute, because what donors do is generally voluntarily, so it's not according to a specific percentage calculation. So they cannot be included in this picture, but this is, of course, a weakness of that typology. Another weakness is the volatility. So we see with a change of government, for instance, one country might decide that it will not stop paying, or that will pay a lot more. So this we've seen, for instance, with Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, was very keen on paying a lot into regional initiatives, but that was very dependent on him as a political leader. So volatility is quite important here. This is the typology then based on the contribution calculation. So we have organizations that have this equal share idea. We have those that have some more economic capacity calculation, and those where we have one or maybe 2 or 3 countries that say, well, we're gonna pay most of it. We'll show as a burden, but of course, in return, we want to also be recognized as leaders and have more influence in that regard. So these would be these clusters, which show that, well, there's not really a convergence towards one model, that all regional organizations are working in the same manner, but rather there's a certain diversity, but also not a complete diversity in the sense that every regional organization is different, but we see a certain amount of clusters. So lastly, going into a bit of qualitative analysis. So how do we explain that some members pay, others don't pay? What we see very often in the Global South is it's very easy often for members to say, well, this year I'm not paying, or I'm going to pay a bit later, or I'm going to pay less than what we initially committed. And what almost all regional organizations share is this fragility in terms of financial terms, that they have to really fight in order to get the money that they were supposed to receive. So why would members contribute to a higher budget? So a higher budget, we see, correlates partly with hegemony, so that there would be one country that says, well, we want to be the leader, which can reflect ideology. So it was quite clear, for instance, in the ideology of Hugo Chavez that I mentioned, that a high budget was important. But it can also be the inclusion of certain national goals and the regional agendas. So if you get something out of your money, so if, for instance, in the field of peace and security, if you see, well, there's a conflict in the region and it needs to be addressed regionally, then some member states might be interested in contributing to solving that issue. There's also the question of staff representation. So if the share of the budget correlates with how much staff we can send, then a member country might be interested in sending more people or in appointing the Secretary General. Why are many members not paying? So this is kind of the reverse of the medal. What we see in many regional organizations is there's a lack of a sanction regimes. So regional organizations don't really have a proper tool to enforce payments, so they can't say, well, if you don't pay on time, then then there will be some consequences. Often that's not the case, or even if sometimes they exist on paper, they're not being applied because the organizations are too afraid of a nationalist backlash. Sometimes member states say also they won't pay because, well, there's already a very high and reliable share of donors or of one hegemon. So why do we need to pay if we have regional aid coming in already? So that's some arguments. Sometimes it's a lack of priority. So in many countries, especially in smaller countries, which have a fairly small budget for their foreign affairs, there will be a certain priority for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the presidency of saying, well, usually first we're gonna spend our money on United Nations contributions, then maybe the continental organizations. Then if there's money left, we'll spend it on our regional organizations. And if we are a member of several regional organizations, then we have to see how much money is left at the end of the day, and there might not be left for the organization that comes low. Then lastly, there are, of course, economic hardships in some instances. So if there's a major crisis, economic or financial, then members will find it hard to contribute. The amount of payment, or the regularity, the reliability of payments is also an indicator for legitimacy. So we can see if organizations are perceived as legitimate is reflected in whether members are willing to pay up or not. Lastly, this differentiation that I mentioned before between core funding and activities. So this is something that many states make, that say, well, we want to contribute to core funding, but not to activities, because core funding we want to keep under our control, but everything else the organization has to find a way on its own. That'll be the final slide to kind of look ahead. So what are some further research that can be done based on the book and the preliminary work that we've done in the book? So one interesting avenue is to look at overlapping regionalisms. So we have many organizations that partly overlap in geography and in mandate, especially in Africa, but also in Latin America. So how do regionalisms live with this competition so that they compete for income from their members? And how do member states deal with the fact that they have to contribute to several regional organizations at the same time? There's also the question of regional actorness. So how much money does a regional organization need in order to become its own proper regional actor? That is not just a tool of its member states, but that can act on its own, that can have its own policies, that can make its own decisions. So how much financial quality is needed here? There's also an interesting research link with a different stream of research on staffing regional organizations. It's Kevin Partenay that's working on that, among others. More money means, of course, more capacity to employ people, to build up a civil service, to build up a bureaucracy. So there's a direct link between those two, and more bureaucracy, the more you have a staff that identifies with a regional project you have, the more they will, in theory, then seek to enlarge their mandate and seek more funding for what they actually want to do. So there's a positive correlation between those two. And finally, the question of organizational cultures. So the question of how much of these specificities, so should we have an equal share, or should we have an economic capacity contribution, for instance, how much does it reflect the culture of the region? So the political culture, the organizational culture, for instance, for the Eurasian regional organization that we've looked to. So how much is still a legacy of Soviet times in terms of organizing the region within the Soviet Union? So there might be interesting work to be done in to what degree does a regional political culture and institutional culture, legal culture, to what degree does it influence this? And then we can link this whole debate to the UN, for instance, to see that there are very different trends on a United Nations level. For instance, trends that we've seen for a long time now seem to trickle down to regional organizations, such as private funding. So where we see very, very clearly right now, the World Health Organizations is heavily dependent on private funding, Gates Foundation, etc. So this is something that so far has played a minor role for regional organizations, but we see that now African Union, for instance, is trying to get money from private sources also, which would completely change the analysis that we've done here, because we get a new source of income coming in, which is more akin to development aid than to member state budgets. But so that's what's on offer for future research. There's a whole comparison with the UN and with the EU budget. I'll wrap up for this presentation for now, and I'll give back the word to Clarissa or to Karina for some Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank, for sharing with us your presentation. Also, thank you for the opportunity that we had to write to the book, but also to discover a little bit more about the agenda on finances of regional organizations. It was all very interesting and also very unexplored. I mean, of course, we are from Brazil. We see research in Portuguese, and we couldn't find a lot of stuff about Mercosur or other organizations that Brazil is a part of. And then even in English, we could see that it was a rather non-explored field for much part of the work. So it was it was really interesting. It was a pleasure to be able to work with that, and then we thank you very much also for the presentation. A question that I was hoping to ask you about all of the issues that were brought up with budgeting regional organizations was when we were writing about Latin America. What do you think could be considered or could we highlight as the main contributions that the organizations in Latin America offer to the studies of regional finances, and what are the main differences that the Global South, because it's very interesting to see things from the perspective of the Global South, but even the Global South is very different in itself. So what would you highlight as the main contributions of this study?
Yes, thank you for that question, Clarissa. So what we saw for Latin America is that there's also no clear trend. There's no one single pattern that would be specifically Latin American. So if we in the book we've had Mercosur, UNASUR, and CARICOM. So if we take those three organizations, they differ quite importantly with how they were set up and how their funding works. Some takeaways though that we took from the work on these three organizations is firstly that the first budget figure that I indicated, for instance, is these 10 million for UNASUR, 10 million Mercosur. So for Latin America, it became very clear that this is only the tip of the iceberg. So whereas for other regional organizations, the African Union, for instance, it seems that the majority of the budget is fairly centralized. So I think with the figures that we can retrieve, we get a good idea. But in Latin America, there seems to be this trend to say, well, we want a minimalist regional administration. We don't want a huge commission with thousands of people working there as regional officials. So that the idea is rather to have a small secretariat, a fairly lean and efficient one. But that the actual work will be done, so to speak, under the surface, so that that every national ministry of the region will have a specific liaison team that deals with Mercosur or UNASUR issues. So the Ministry of Defense will have a small team on that. The Ministry of Trade will, of course, have a larger, etc. Infrastructure, health, education. All of them will have some stuff that is at least partly dedicated to it. So this is in other regional organizations. These are people that are completely detached to the regional organization and work for the regional organization. So what we see in at least in South America is that this operates under the surface. So with our analysis, we were not able to capture this. So it would be really interesting to dig a bit deeper and to ask the question, well, how big is actually Mercosur administration if we count all the people that contribute to it, and how big is actually the real budget that must be much bigger than the official figures. So this was something that looking at Latin America really helped us to put into perspective this idea that Latin American regionalism is very cost efficient and very cheap. It's probably not, but for this you really have to dig under the surface. And as a second point, what we saw is then the difference between South America and the Caribbean in terms of aid dependence. So whereas aid still plays a relatively important role in the Caribbean, for UNASUR, for instance, there was basically no external aid. It was very difficult for external contributors to find a way into it. It was not necessarily that. It seems at least that it was not that UNASUR said, "Well, we don't want to do anything to do with donors." This is more the case for certain Central Asian organizations, where, for instance, Russia would say, "No, we don't want anyone else to fund into this because this is our own strategic area." So it's not necessarily that UNASUR said, "No, we don't want any money from outside," but it's more that how the bureaucracy was built up, it didn't really enable a good dialogue with other regions and other funders. So it was maybe not intended from the beginning, but it was a bit of a consequence. Whereas with Mercosur, the story is a bit more complicated because initially there was quite a lot of support from the European Union financially, and then at some point there was a backlash against this. European Union was quite unhappy with the results that it got from investing money. The member states in Mercosur were not happy with the European Union telling them what they should do. So at some point this was dismantled. So we see quite different patterns. So I would say in total, so there's certain things that maybe we see specifically in Latin America, or we see better in Latin America than in other regions, but there's no specific Latin American way of doing funding as such.
Frank, we have two questions of our audience. One is from Mauricio. He asks, are there some particular reasons for the 694 ratio between members and donors in Asian's budget? He loved the lecture. And Lucas asks, how does the donor modality is applied, if it's applied, to the South America case as UNASUR and Mercosur?
Okay, so, well, thank you for those questions, and I'm happy that you enjoyed the lecture. So on the first question, why ASEAN is so heavily dependent on donor income. We were ourselves a bit surprised that it was so much. It comes from many different donors, so it's Japan is very important there, which is not a member of ASEAN, but one of the main contributors. Australia, European Union, etc. The UK now separately. So there are many donors that have gotten involved. Part of the answer to your question is related to the contribution formula. So ASEAN is one of those regional organizations where every country pays exactly the same amount. So whether you're Singapore, the most advanced economy in the region, or whether you're Myanmar. So this means, of course, that what the poorest country is able to afford will be set as a standard for everyone, because you can't expect Myanmar to pay tens of millions of dollars into the budget. So a consequence of this equal share is that the share needs to be very low. It needs to be adapted to the poorest countries. So in principle, Singapore or also other countries could pay much more into it, but officially they don't, which means that the core budget from member states tends to be very low, and so that the organization needs to find other ways to fund all its activities and everything that it wants to do. And for this, it then looks at development donors. There are sometimes ways around this. So Singapore will, for instance, finance certain activities directly without going through ASEAN, something that it's willing to fund. Or you might have Indonesia, for instance, which hosts a headquarters that provides a building, or that provides certain financial provisions that are not part of their official contributions, but that also help to sustain the organizations. So this to say that probably the 6% is this is the official centralized figure. But what we also see is that some countries will fund certain agencies or certain projects directly without going through ASEAN. But if they don't go through ASEAN, it's very difficult to track. Last part of the answer is maybe that ASEAN has been quite successful in attracting money. It's considered to be fairly efficient in how it's spending, how it sets up programs. There was a lot on, for instance, on disaster management after there were these big typhoons in Southeast Asia and other natural catastrophes. So these were examples where donors saw, well, ASEAN is very good in is a good interlocutor to deal with this, to send money. Then ASEAN has also become a very important political partner, so for trade agreements and political relations. So it has really become quite successful in that regard, which also explains why it is able to attract more and to absorb more money than other regional organizations. On the second question, so on the question of donors for South America. So for UNASUR, while it still had a budget, you know, we're talking as historians almost, but it didn't have a meaningful share of donors coming in. It was a very inward-looking setup of the organization. So there was little institutional way of, say, a foreign ambassador to be accredited to UNASUR as you would have with other organizations. So there was a very difficult inroad in there, and it was more centered on inside. In the beginning, there was also a large focus on defense, which was considered strategic and sensitive, so where maybe you don't want donors to come in. With Mercosur, the pattern was a bit different. As I mentioned in the beginning, the European Union was funding Mercosur to a high degree, also because there was a negotiation for a trade agreement. There was political cooperation. But when the EU started to fund more the Parliament of Mercosur, so the democratic pillar, this was considered then as an intrusion by some Mercosur countries, well, mainly Brazil, of saying, well, this is now getting a bit too much into our sovereignty. If you are going to help set up a parliament that might become supranational, so this led then to kind of a dispute between the EU and Mercosur, and the EU stopped funding, and so at this point, external funding is not particularly relevant, at least in those two cases, but there has been at least a phase where external funding was very relevant for Mercosur.
Frank, we have some questions. Now it's Professor Brigitte Pfeiffer, the colleague.
Yes.
She made a meeting with us 2 weeks ago, and she asks, did you also investigate for which purpose the budget is used? For example, does most of it go into keeping the organization going, the core part, or is significant amount used for specific activities? For example, election monitoring. And she asks also, how does that vary across organizations? And I will say also why some organizations feel that it's more important to support core activities and not that all other kind of activities. Because integration activities is not as important and as core, the core, but why? That's the point. And I think Clarissa wants to ask one question.
Yeah, adding up on the questions, thank you for the answers as well. We were thinking about, Barbara actually made a question, and I would like to add up on this question about how the donors can influence the regional activities and the development of the member states' agenda. So this was actually a question that we were dealing with a lot while writing the book, right? How can we measure the influences of donors on the agenda setting, and if there is a specific agenda that attracts more donors or not, or and this question actually links with the Karina previous question on why and how are we financing specific agendas, and what are the influences of the donors on the scenario.
Okay, thank you for those three questions. So I'll take Britta's question first. So in the order as they were posed, so the spending pattern, spending pattern was not the primary focus of the book, but still many of the chapters dig into it. Initially, we were quite interested in peace and security, because it tends to be something very expensive. It's not something that all organizations do, but those that are involved in it usually have, such as the African Union or Southern African Development Community. For them, it's a sizable part of their budget. But of all the expenses, the patterns vary. So those that we looked at, they're all multi-purpose organizations, so they have at least 2 or 3 policy fields that they are supposed to cover. And in most cases, we see that it's still member states have certain expectations on which field should be covered, what is correspondent to their own national interest, or to their to an agenda that they want to push. So there are some activities that by nature are less expensive than others. So say trade negotiations tend to be less expensive than doing regional infrastructure. And we see that with budgets of $10–20 million, you can't really build a railroad across one region. I mean, it's a tiny, it would be a tiny drop. So what a lot of these organizations spend their money on is more the coordinations, setting up policies. They often don't necessarily implement the actual projects. For this, they rely on national agencies or on program consortiums to actually implement this. The ratio varies. So for ASEAN, we see, for instance, that the share of activities is very high, and the core budget is still important, but in relative terms, it's quite low. Whereas we have others. Say, for instance, the CPLP, the Portuguese language countries, where most of the money is just spent on the salaries, and there's not so much money left to actually do something concretely, which goes already a bit in the second question that Karina posed. So this is why certain countries prefer core or integration activities. That usually integration activities are more expensive, so it's that's already a big point. And the idea that core budget is something that we want under our control. This is the salaries for the staff that works there, for instance. So, or this is a building. We've seen the African Union, for instance, received a gift from China, from the People's Republic of China, which was a building of the African Union Commission, and afterwards it was found out that it was taped, that there were that apparently you have to look into the gift horse's mouth once in a while. So so there are certain things in core activities that are fairly sensitive. So you want to be in charge of or have some control over who actually works there, who decides there. You want to be able to influence these people. So so this is something that we see very often, that member states want to put pressure on the officials that come from their own country and try to. And so so if these would be paid by someone else, then it's getting a bit more difficult because they have less loyalty towards you. So this I think partly explains why core activities are still considered, well, let's do this first, then if we have more money, we can always do contribute to activities. But it's often, even in African organizations, it's even in their treaties. The SADC treaty, for instance, that I studied, it's clearly indicated that the Secretary General will need to look for resources. So that's part of their job. That's also the expectation, that we give you core funding and then you put leverage. On the third and last question, on the influence of donors. So in some organizations, it's quite impressive. So since they're putting so much money in it, the influence concerns the topics first. So and what we've seen is, it's not necessarily that one donor comes in, that I don't know, the World Bank comes in and says, well, you have to do environment, or you have to do water management. Like sometimes it has been imposed, but what we see more is that since regional organizations are supposed to attract money, they try to propose something that they think will please the donors. So that's why we've seen, for instance, quite a number of gender programs coming up, which were probably more a reflection of, well, there is money from donors available for this, so let's set up a project on that side, because we're more likely to be able to pay our own salaries also from that. There are some donors that dispatch staff, that pay staff directly, so that becomes very influential then, where you have these strange situations, and that you've had with the European Union dispatching experts for technical training on rules of origins, for instance, for trade negotiations to some countries. So they would train the negotiators that were supposed to negotiate the trade agreement with the European Union. So you have kind of a sort of a circle. So there you have a lot of potential for influence if you are sort of influencing the people that you're also negotiating with. So it can be, and then lastly, it's also about reporting. The donors usually want to see how have you spent our money. We want to see the financial report. We want to see if it's been well spent, and if regional organizations cannot justify the expenses, they run into trouble. The Central African regional organizations, for instance, couldn't justify a lot of expenses. So the Court of Auditors, the European Court of Auditors, has said we cannot pay any more development aid to these organizations until they have explained well this how this money was spent. So there's a fight between development aid and the auditors in that respect. So it's so that means that a lot of regional organizations integrate standards of accounting, of reporting into their own bureaucracy, basically, so that they get influenced by donors in that regard, and that they build up a sort of double loyalty. They're still loyal to their members because that's where the mandate comes from, but they also have to be loyal to the donors because that's what allows them to do projects. But often is also something that is used as personal income, that for what this we see in various regional organizations in the global south, that, well, if you attend certain meetings, for instance, from donors, you get a per diem, you get to travel. This can be like become a second salary. So the influence can also be that those that are working in these regional organizations develop a very strong loyalty to donors because they personally gain from it.
In this case of financial reports, it's easy to find to see it when you are relating to donors, but in general, it's not easy to see how much we spend with integration. And it's a problem of their concern about public opinion, or is a lack of democracy? What's your opinion about that?
I think it depends from one organization to another. So we see, for instance, in Central Asia, so the post-Soviet regional organizations that we looked at, it's quite difficult to get information. Even in Russian, we had experts that speak and read Russian, but even in getting this information was very difficult. And there it seems that it's more the idea of like, we don't want other people to know what we're doing, and it's a lot of military expenses also. So there the authors had to go through newspaper reports, or have to go through, okay, what are, looking at the Ministry of Defense of Russia, do they have some reports on what they spend money on? Because on the regional side, it was not quite clear. So for certain organizations, it's really like this is none of your business. Like this is for others, it's more of a capacity issue. If a general secretariat, I've seen doing archival work, there's sometimes organizations which they have maybe one person working in the archive that is there to scan and digitalize the reports, and they don't necessarily have the capacity to put everything online and to make it available. If you go there in person, then they're happy to share it with you, but it's sometimes just an issue of capacity, which is an issue for Global South organizations. There are some laudable exceptions. For instance, we found that the East African community was a pleasure to work with, because they publish everything online. They have very detailed reports. So it's not that that all organizations are necessarily bad on it, so there are some that put an effort on that say, well, we have that, and then what maybe contributes to it in the East African community case is that there's more parliamentary scrutiny, so that the ministers, the national ministers for regional integration, have to justify the budget and the contributions in front of the parliament. So this of course gives more transparency. It's not necessarily democracy, because several countries in there that are not exactly democracies, but there's at least scrutiny from Parliament, so they have to justify in front of the public to some degree.
Thank you. And then this whole debate brings up the question about accountability that the organizations have to bring about. But one thing that called our attention on this accountability issue was about the arrears and the delayed payments, and how they continue to be a part of the budget, and how regional organizations still count upon these contributions from years ago that were not made. So a question that I would like to pose as well, considering the whole scenario that we're living on with the pandemic, the COVID-19, and the consequential economic recession, and so what can we think about on how regional organizations can balance their budgets on these prospective scenarios, considering that we already had problems with payments before, and now probably organizations are not a priority for many countries. So what are the solutions? What are the insights that we can have about balancing the finances of regional organizations?
What we see currently is that there are regional organizations that are able to increase their income because they show themselves as being useful in the pandemic. So the African Union is a good example there. It has set up a Center for Disease Control a couple of years ago on a continental level, so which has been the central coordinating unit for information and communication unit on the continental level. So there, if an organization now shows itself to be of use at the moment for coordinating to say buy medication or buy equipment, then I think member state can be more convinced to pay up their arrears. And if the organization, of course, is not able to do that, then member states will continue to say, well, do we really need to fund this? We'll rather fund another organization that is more important, or will increase our contribution to the World Health organizations because they are more helpful at this moment. So this is one way. So to show, okay, we are of use, and in Africa, we see it quite clearly that there already have been regional structures built up after Ebola, so that can be used, that are tested and proven to some degree. The other way is, and this also the African Union does, is to use this time for fundraising. So to go to private donors, to go to businesses, banks, philanthropic foundations, etc., to collect money. So basically to get to get money directly from the non-state actors. So this can be also an opportunity at the moment, because there's so much. There's so many foundations getting involved, and some business associations, etc., that want to contribute to solving the crisis. So to show that, well, you can donate the money to us, and we'll use it in a meaningful way. Otherwise, it's so I think what we'll see is, and what we're already seeing, that there's some organizations that will come out stronger, or that are coming out stronger of the crisis, and others that have already had troubles before, and that will intensify the troubles that they've had in being assertive towards the members. Generally, regional organizations have a big problem, or I'm not sure if it's a problem or not, but a big constraint at least, is that they cannot run a deficit. So they cannot borrow money, or they cannot just go into the red. So they always depend on the money that actually comes in. So if a member says, yes, we're going to pay you $5 million this year, and then they don't pay it, it becomes very difficult, because they have to adjust the budget. So they cannot just do as most states would do. If a state doesn't have enough tax income, then they will try to increase the debt rate, for instance. So this, right now, regional organizations can't do it. The EU is discussing at the moment whether you should be allowed to go on the capital market, and to have debts. So this is a discussion still to be had, but for now, it's regional organizations need to work with what they've received.
Okay, Frank, I want to thank you very much about this very interesting webinar. It was a pleasure for us, and I think it's important to discuss this kind of issue, because it's not common, and it's not common sense, and we need to think the international organizations not just like trade point, but in this other aspects and points. And that's why I thank you very much. And I thank you, everybody that was watching in YouTube and Facebook. And it's a pleasure, and we are open to you. Every time you want to talk with us, we will be glad.
Well, thank you for having me. It was really nice to do this Q&A, and also to those that were tuning in, or that posted questions. Thank you for for that. Thanks also to Barbara Neves in the background, who was producing this show and this webinar. So thank you, and all the best for the Regionalism Observatory.
Thank you.